Danilo Caputo, you are a film director. You spent your childhood in a small town near Tarente in Puglia.
Yeah.
And So the Wind is your second feature film, right?
Yeah.
Rob Hopkins, you teach permaculture in England, and you wrote many books on the subject. And you are well known as one of the founders of the Transition Network, a nonprofit that supports initiatives of cities in transition all around the globe, following the example of what you set up in your own city of Totnes in England, which is well known for being one of the first city, or maybe the first city in transition in the world. And your latest book is From What If to What Is, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want, promotes what we also promote in our Moving Mountain program, which is the power of imagination for a better future. So we're very happy to have you with us, Rob, and very glad, Danilo, that you accepted to have this conversation, because your film is about the respect of nature, and how do you cope from one world which is more maybe industrial and to maybe another world which would be more about respecting nature and agriculture. So I will start with you, Danilo, because in your film, one of the characters, Paula, says people are polluted in the head. How does this happen?
Yeah, that's actually one of the very first ideas, one of the ideas that then made me write this film. Because Taranto, the city where I live, where I grew up, is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, steel factory in Europe. And I think we always, I grew up seeing this factory as the problem, and as told today, I think it is a problem. But then at some point, I also realized that the mentality we have now is also the problem. And I realized that when there was a referendum asking people whether they wanted the factory shut or not, and it was more like a poll, not like a real referendum. So nothing was going to come out of it. But I thought at least there was a chance to give a big signal, because of course many people are sensitive to the fact that it's a problem, especially in the neighborhoods that have been built just 1 kilometer away from the factory. Like they have some of the highest cancer rates in Europe. So I thought it was the moment to give a big signal. But then only 30% of the people having the right actually went to vote. And that really got me thinking about the resignation and overall the mentality that we have. And it's not, we don't have it by chance. I think we have it because after 60 years now of living with this factory, our mentality has changed. And as you say, it's a matter of imagination. We're not able to imagine ourselves in any other way. We're not capable of thinking that we can live also without this factory. And that slowly got me thinking about this mentality and how it translated itself in a lot of small things. And that's where the idea of mental pollution came from. I sometimes think of it as as a person who is stuck in a toxic relationship. Of course, the toxic or abusive partner is a problem and needs to be removed. But even after a divorce, the abused person will still need to go through assistance and to go through therapy, because the damage also has been interiorized. It's the mentality that has been assimilated. And I think that's a bit the case with Taranto, with us living here. And to me, the idea of mental pollution resumed all of this.
How can we depollute people? Can we give hope and can we stimulate the will to construct things that are more positive?
It was interesting to hear Danilo use the analogy of the abusive relationship. It's one that I often use when I meet people, as I'm sure many activists do as well, people who say, yes, but the oil age was fantastic. Look, it did all of this amazing things, and now we have fossil fuels have meant that now we have so many things are better around the world. And I say, yeah, absolutely. The first 3 months of many abusive relationships is really fantastic. But the fact that the first 3 months was great doesn't mean you stick around for the next 20 years. It doesn't mean that it's going to, that same pattern is going to continue. I feel like a lot of the work that I do with the transition movement is about saying, it's about longing. It's a really big part of this for me, is how do we create longing for a low carbon, post carbon world? Because if this was a transition that was going to be created by facts and figures and graphs and rational arguments, we would have done it in the 1980s, and it would have been so much easier and such a gentler slope that we would have to navigate. Now we have left it so late that it's such a steep cuts transition that we have to make. And I always like to use the analogy of talking about the moon. When Neil Armstrong went to the moon in 1969, it wasn't his idea. It wasn't JFK's idea in 1960 when he announced that was announced the mission to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. We had been going to the moon for decades before then, in stories, in songs. Tintin went to the moon. Frank Sinatra went to the moon. We had been to the moon so many times collectively that we had created such a deep longing for that to happen that it actually only took us 9 years from scratch. And the average age of the team who got Neil Armstrong onto the moon was 26. So I feel like a lot of the big work that we need to be doing right now is about how do we cultivate longing for a post-carbon world, a more biodiverse world, a more connected, more resilient world. And that is the work of imagination. That is the work of storytelling. It is the work of Rilke, the poet, once, it's one of my favorite quotes. He said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens." And so storytelling and imagination and films and like Danilo is creating are, for me, part of it is about how do we allow the future to enter into people so that we can replace people's often default image of what a low carbon future would be like, that you're living in a cold cave eating green potatoes, and actually replace that with how absolutely extraordinary it could be if we did everything that needed to be done and we got to zero carbon by 2030, which is what the science demands of us. These 10 years will have felt like a revolution of the imagination. It will have been one of the most extraordinary periods in history to live through. And that's what I like to try and focus people on, is how do we cultivate the longing rather than just focus on all the stuff that's really, really dreadful.
Danilo, in your film, you're using the character of the grandmother as a positive character, someone who understands the values of nature, who can talk with nature and do things, mysticals also with nature. Do you think that did you want to show that the older generation maybe are wiser, or more in contact with the earth, or maybe an example, and maybe also the newer generation is giving us hope? Is this something that you wanted to show?
No, I think my starting point was different. I think that at the origin of this character, the grandmother, was the idea that Italy, like many other countries, went through a sort of anthropological mutation in the 60s, where we basically went from being a rural country and a rural society with those values to becoming quite rapidly an industrialized country with new values, new language brought by TV, new habits, etc. And the idea of the grandmother came because I guess old people now would be the only people who remember that a different world existed, and so the only one who are I don't know the exact word, repository or depository of those values. I mean, they're the only ones who witnessed that. And what happened also, what intrigued me is that a lot of young people now seem to be almost excavating, like archaeologists, those values that have been not only overcome but also forgotten. Like a lot of people have been rediscovering the traditional music, but also the dialect, which, for example, I grew up being told that I couldn't speak dialect, and a lot of people are rediscovering the beauty of that. And I think that goes along with also return to the countryside, with people who, like Nika, decide to embrace agriculture, whereas people were stuck in agriculture at a different time, and then they turned their back to it as if something to be ashamed of. That was the case of people growing up in the 60s and 70s. Now people have realized that there's nothing to be ashamed of, and they feel like trying that style of life. And I think when they do that, they cannot look at their parents, because their parents grew up in a completely different world. So what they can look at for inspiration and also for learning even practical techniques is their grandparents.
One of the things that we did in my town, and quite a lot of transition groups do when they start, is to do oral history interviews with people, because we're talking about a future where we use a lot less energy and we live in much more local economies and we consume more local food, and we use less cars and we travel less distances, and that's not an experience within my lifetime. But talking to people about the 1940s, the 1950s, there is still some of that, and you can get a taste of it, and it's really important. I would always ask people when I'd interview them, because you don't want to romanticize the past, because it was really tough and it wasn't that great. And I would always ask people, what are the things that you're really glad that we have left behind in the past, and what are the things that you wish we had brought with us more? And I remember that one of the main things I came away from those conversations with was the deepest appreciation for the washing machine, and the role that the transformation that the washing machine brought to women's lives, and how every Monday was wash day, and just how awful that was. So there are many aspects of Western civilization that I wouldn't mourn the passing of too much, but the washing machine I would fight for a long time, I think.
Where we were writing the film, we were mindful of that, and we wanted to make sure that what Nika does was not to go back to the world of her grandmother in a way. She doesn't want to become her grandmother, to go back to an idealized, maybe romanticized world. But in a way, she wants to take what's valuable and what's precious from that world and bring it. And mix it with the science, with her agronomy studies. And I think in a way that if we want to cultivate longing, that will seduce me more than suggesting that somehow what we want is to go back to life as it was in the 60s in Italy, or in the 20s in the UK.
In the film, Nika is struggling a lot in order to fight against what has been what the society is constructed by the money and all this system that is very hard to fight against. Is the fight maybe sometime with violence, as we see it nowadays by some ecologists? Is this the only way, or can we try to understand each other maybe by talking to each other, between generations, between people who have different interests?
I don't think we necessarily need violence, but I think we need to draw attention to the problem, and we need to draw urgent attention to the problem. And I think sometimes dialogue can work, but sometimes dialogue just goes on as if we had all the time and all the convenience to talk about it as we want it. And I think that a little shock treatment can remind everyone that this is urgent and that something has to be done. We shouldn't just do something about it, but we must.
No, I would completely agree with Danilo. I think we have to be any kind of rational, clear light of day analysis would say that climate change is an enormous act of violence by older generations against younger people, against younger generations and future generations, and the inaction of governments around the world, and the deceit and subterfuge of oil and gas companies, like tobacco companies before them, is a manifestation of an economy that feels it completely acceptable to dump its impacts into the future. That we see the future as being like a waste dump. We'll just dump it there. They'll figure it out. You know, and actually, and speaking in the UK as well, you know, from a UK perspective, we also have to look at Brexit, which has really been an attack by older people on the wishes and the future of younger people, and student loans and so on and so on. There are many things that play that same role. So I think young people today have absolutely every reason to be absolutely furious. And Greta Thunberg, I think, is one of the most sort of eloquent people at putting that. But I've found so much inspiration from the youth strikes for climate, and I've taken my kids on all of them, and they make me cry every time. There's such a power to them. The risk of them is that as older people we say, oh great, well done kids, this is great, you know, and young people I know who are part of that movement and who are phenomenally educated and phenomenally eloquent, they say, we don't want your congratulations, we want your support, we want you out here too, you know, don't patronize us by patting us on the head and saying how great we are. And I think, you know, this transfer of pollution and debt and climate change onto the younger generation has to absolutely stop. And the role of everything now really needs to be, you know, our education system needs to be saying, how do we give you absolutely everything that you need in order to be the people who can play the best role as stewards of this world, and how do we make sure you have everything you need in order to be able to turn this around.
Danilo, in your film, there is this bacteria called Xylella, right? That is killing olive trees in Puglia, and I went to Lecce, and I can testify of this. This is a real disaster. In your film, you are telling us that Nika is finding a solution that is actually a natural solution. So the father is saying, "Oh, we tried everything. We tried all the pesticides," but she's looking for another way of saving the trees, saving her grandmother's trees. We can see that she listens to the trees, that she tastes the earth. She's really in contact with the nature. So your message is that maybe first nature is stronger than us, and maybe the solution comes also from nature. Is this the message you wanted to give us?
The reason why Nika is a totally different approach, I have to say, this only partially comes from my knowledge in agronomy. Actually, this comes from the way I think about my body, because I've had several health problems, and you know, Western medicine basically just tends to focus on the manifestation of the problem, let's say on the symptom. Whereas there's a lot of non-Western medicine, physiotherapy, and holistic treatments that will look at the whole body, that will really try to understand how that symptom is connected to something else. And when I was reading books about alternative agronomy, and I think it was especially about biodynamic farming, I saw that actually they were talking about the plants the same way that a holistic doctor would be talking about our body as human beings. And that really fascinated me. And I was looking for a way to create intimacy between Nika and those trees. And this approach immediately created all the intimacy I wanted, because she really listened to those trees like she would to a body. She tried to understand how the sickness could be related to the way those trees were being fed or taken care of. And I think I'm not an expert, so I wonder what Rob thinks, but I think that if that makes sense for the human body, it must also be valuable when it comes to treating trees. And so that's why I thought that's the way she should have gone. And I think that if the sickness comes from a balance that has been broken, then the remedy, the cure, must come from a balance that has been restored. And so that's why I thought of that kind of ending.
Well, I think he's absolutely right. It's that what we have done in our Western industrial growth-based economy is to break things down into separate pieces and think that we can understand things better by viewing them in isolation. But actually, the world is a complex, holistic, interconnected system, and it's really our kind of arrogance to imagine that we can that we can understand that, and that's we can break that down. So it's one of the things when I first studied permaculture that was so interesting, was that was starting to really understand how nature works, and starting to understand the complexity and the holistic nature of things. Bill Mollison, who was the guy who created permaculture, he once said, if we lose all the universities of the world, we lose nothing. If we lose the forests, we lose everything, because the forest is where we go to learn and to study and to really understand how a complex system works. And in the transition movement, we take that model where you look at how a forest manages water and moves it around in that complex system of storing water in all kinds of different places and nutrients, and how it moves it around, and saying that's the understanding that needs to underpin how we approach agriculture. But at the same time, it's also how we need to approach economics in the places where we live. That actually the aim of that should be to make money circulate as many times locally and make as much happen as possible, rather than it all just being extracted by massive companies who then take all that money away offshore or wherever it needs to go. So for me, I remember when I did my permaculture training, there was after about 4 days, I started to see the world differently. I started to see the world in that complexity and in those kind of systems. And I think once you start to see the world like that, you can't unsee it. And any films that are able to help people move away from just seeing things in isolation and start to see things joined up as a complex web, we need more and more of that.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was great talking to both of you.
Thank you, Danilo. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.